So I am presenting it a little bit differently today than most people do, probably at my own risk, but we're going to see how that works out. So basically, I've got a few steps to the argument that I want to present. So the first slide here, basically the steps are to go from the PSR, which is the principle of sufficient reason. The version that I endorse is that for everything that exists or occurs, there is a sufficient reason for its existence or occurrence. So events, there's got to be some explanation or reason that the event occurs. Objects, there's got to be some reason or explanation for the existence of the object. We'll go from that into the universe, saying that the universe is a contingent object, or collection of objects, I guess. And so the universe is contingent. And then from there, taking those 2 points together, we see that there would be a necessary foundation for the existence of the universe. And then from there, we'll look at the implications of that and what we can sort of do a conceptual analysis of that necessary foundation and see what theistic implications that we have. So I do want to define my terms here of contingency and necessary. So by contingent, I mean an object that can fail to exist. It's possible that the object doesn't exist. And then a necessary object would be an object that it's not possible that the object doesn't exist. So that's kind of the different versions I'm using. It's not just that it exists in all possible worlds, but it's actually not possible that the object doesn't exist. That's what I mean by necessary object. And then obviously a contingent object would be an object that does possibly not exist. So what reasons do we have, starting at the bottom, what reasons do we have to affirm the PSR? We'll go to, we'll call this slide 2. So the first one I want to present, and this is an argument made by Alex Proust, and it's called the epistemological argument. So it goes, premise 1, if the PSR is false, we have no empirical knowledge. Premise 2, we do have empirical knowledge. And premise 3, therefore, the PSR is not false. And so the second one, got a question, what modality? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that question, but go ahead and raise your hand and we'll talk about it in the Q&A. So the second one seems pretty obvious. We do have empirical knowledge. We know that, when you strike a match, it causes a flame, with different things. So premise 2 seems pretty straightforward. So why premise 1? If the PSR is false, we have no empirical knowledge. Well, let's take an example of an empirical knowledge claim, that sunlight comes from the sun. So that's our empirical knowledge claim. And let's let this graph over here, I got this pie graph where we got a red region and a blue region. Let the red region represent that it's caused by the sun, and the blue region represent our violation of the PSR. That is to say, it's not caused by anything. The sunlight just is here inexplicably, no explanation at all. It's just brute sunlight, right? Well, in order to know the size of the red in this pie graph, we have to know the size of the blue. Because if the blue is undefined, then by definition, the red is also undefined. And so when we assign a probabilities to something, we're assigning it in terms of the causes present, right? So it's very unlikely if I roll a 20-sided die that I'm going to get 5 fives in a row, because the die is unlikely to produce that result. But if we start talking about uncaused, just brute objects or brute events, well, we're denying that there are causes present. And so there just is no basis to assign a probability to such a thing. And so it'd be undefined. And if we're denying the PSR, we're going to say it's some positive, it's greater than 0, but we're not able to say what it is. But if we can't define the blue, then by nature of the case, we also can't define the red. And this will be true not just for sunlight, it'll be true for any empirical claim. And so as a result, if the PSR is false, we can't differentiate between the probability that whatever phenomena is occurring for no reason and that it's occurring caused by the cause that we're supposing. And so we end up with no knowledge claims. Obviously, we do have empirical knowledge claims, and so we do have a reason to affirm the PSR. Another way of looking at this short argument is that it essentially is showing that our empirical knowledge rests on the PSR, that our knowledge about the world is dependent on the PSR. So denying the PSR, it's very central to our knowledge, and so knocking it out is not a small thing to do. So another argument, and I believe Josh Rasmussen has run this one before. Let me go ahead and pop it up. I like the way that he actually puts this one too. And it's essentially from the lack of violations of the PSR. So premise 1, if the PSR is false, we would encounter violations of the PSR. Premise 2, we encounter no violations of the PSR. Forgot my period there, sorry. Therefore, the PSR is not false. So premise 2 seems pretty obvious. We walk around, we don't see things popping into existence or that sort of thing. We just don't see that happening. When we see an object, whenever we encounter an object, we at least, in my experience, hopefully in yours as well, we can trace it back to some sort of cause, some sort of explanation for why it's there. If we encounter a car, we don't think it just inexplicably is there suddenly. We think that, oh no, must be some car manufacturer. Now, why is this surprising if the PSR is false? Well, if you think about it, for any space, any point in space, there are an infinite number of things that don't exist, or near infinite number of things that don't exist in that space. So for example, in my kitchen, there is not a Bengal tiger. There is not a pink elephant. There's not a flamingo. There's so many things that are not in my kitchen. But if the PSR is false, then those things, there's some probability, some positive probability that those things would suddenly come into existence. And they don't. And so if there's a near infinite number of things that could exist at any point in space, and there's a positive probability for each of those things, then we'd expect to see lots of things popping into existence. The fact that we don't gives us good inductive reasons for affirming the PSR. That is to say that things don't just exist for no reason. So those are at least a couple of reasons to affirm the PSR. And so that kind of, let me get our next slide here. That kind of goes into our next point, which is that the universe is contingent. Now, why say that? Well, first of all, number one, if the universe is necessary, then the actual world is necessary. Number two, the actual world is not necessary. Therefore, number three, the universe is not necessary. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if the universe is necessary, if everything that's in the universe exists necessarily, then what would be the case is that we've got essentially what's called modal collapse, and that is that there's only one possible world, and that's the actual world. And so if everything's necessary, then everything's necessary. And so our modal intuitions, that is the feeling that things could be different than they are, give us reason to think that there are other possible worlds. But if there are other possible worlds, then that means that this world is not necessary. So for example, if you had 3 blueberries this morning, well, you could have instead had 4, it seems, but that would be a different possible world. And so the causes, and this essentially goes through history as well, especially if you're a naturalist, then you'd expect just a physical determinism that flows through the universe. And so you'd end up with, again, a necessary world. So the fact that we don't experience that modal collapse, that necessary world, or at least our modal intuition strongly suggests that we don't, that gives us good reason to think that the universe is not necessary. Another reason, I'll give you another argument. Bear with me 1 second here. It's another modal type argument, and that is that the universe is possibly created. Obviously I've got sort of a homage to God with a hand there pointing at the globe on the slide, but the universe is possibly created. So it may be by God, maybe by aliens, maybe by a multiverse, whatever. It doesn't matter. The universe is possibly created. Whatever the creator is, it's possible that the universe is created. Well, if the universe is possibly created, then it does not exist necessarily. Now, why would that be the case? Well, if the universe is possibly created, then there's some possible world in which the universe is created. But it would then not be eternal in that universe because it's created in that universe. And so it would not be necessary in that universe. But that is in that possible world. But if an object is possibly not necessary, if an object is possibly not necessary, then it is not necessary. It can't be necessary in some possible worlds. So it can't be contingently necessary, for example. And so therefore the universe does not exist necessarily. And so hopefully that's as clear as mud. But basically, if it's possible that the world is created, then it's not possible that it is always not created. It's kind of the thrust of that argument. And again, if you have questions about this, we're going to do Q&A. In a few minutes, I'll be through the slides, and we'll just do Q&A. Another sort of knockdown reason to think that the universe is contingent is that our universe began to exist. Now, there are a lot of arguments philosophically for the beginning of time and that sort of thing. But I'll just throw up a quote from Stephen Hawking. And he said before he died that all of the evidence seems to indicate that the universe has not existed forever, but that it had a beginning about 15 billion years ago. And so there's a lot of, that's a whole different argument as far as the beginning of the universe, but at least we're justified in thinking that the universe began to exist. Whether we can know that with certainty or not, fine. We can just set that aside. It doesn't matter. And the point is, we're at least reasonable. It's reasonable for somebody to say, yeah, the universe began to exist based on the scientific evidence, other reasons as well, but at least the scientific evidence gives us some reason. So for those reasons, we have a good reason to believe that the universe existed necessarily. I'm sorry, that the universe exists contingently. And so those two things, the PSR and the contingency of the universe, slide into our argument, which I will post now. I've got this sort of a simplified version, but I've reduced it to 3 premises to make it a little bit simpler. So number 1, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. That's the PSR. Number 2, if the universe, that is the collection of contingent objects, the things that could possibly not exist, has an explanation for existence, then that explanation is a non-contingent object, right? So if we want to know why are there things that are in this category of contingent object, well, it can't be a contingent object because then it would be in the category to be explained. It must be a necessary object. And so therefore, the explanation for the universe is a necessary object. Now, I'm obviously omitting a few obvious premises, like, for example, the universe exists should technically be a premise in the argument. But this is the basic thrust of the reasoning. If you want to be pedantic, we can certainly flesh out those obvious premises, but the basic reasoning goes through on those premises. So where can we go from there? Well, what I think we can do is look at what implications do we have for a necessary foundation for the universe. And I think we can give at least 3, probably 4. So what are those implications? Well, number 1, we'll actually go in reverse order. So number 1, it's immaterial, because if it's the explanation for the existence of material reality, then it must be immaterial. It can't be material and explain the existence of material reality. Number 2, it must be powerful, because it brings about the existence of the universe. It must be eternal. We talked about that. If it exists necessarily, it cannot possibly fail to exist, and so it would entail that it exists throughout time in every universe that it exists, or timelessly in those universes that don't have time. And then finally, personhood. Why think that it has personhood, or why think that it's a person? Well, this again goes back to modal collapse. So a person can make different decisions. They can decide A or B or C or whatever. They've got different effects that they can bring about. And so a person can bring about contingent effects. But an impersonal object, an impersonal cause, or an impersonal explanation, we would expect it to bring about deterministically whatever effects it is that it's going to bring about. When I strike a match, it isn't that it might bring about a flame, or it might bring about a bouquet of flowers, or it might bring about a pink flamingo, right? If I strike a match, it's going to bring about a flame. And so an impersonal object is going to have, deterministic effects. And so that gives us reason to think that since whatever is the necessary foundation for the universe, it hasn't brought about a necessary effect. Therefore, the foundation of the universe is not necessary. And so that I will admit that the personhood is probably the weakest of those 4 attributes. But nonetheless, I think it is implied by the contingency argument. But nonetheless, it slides neatly into our cumulative case of arguments. So what I've done is I've kind of put together a list of a few different arguments, ones that we've talked about here in the server, and some of the different attributes that we can deduce from each of these arguments. And you don't need to get all of the attributes from every argument, but there's a few different attributes that we can get from different arguments to put together this picture. Now, Occam's razor would say that we should not multiply causes beyond what's necessary, and so we can have one cause or one explanation that will actually satisfy all of these. Then why not go with one? Why say that there's 5 for 5 arguments if you have one that'll do the trick? And so we've got these different attributes that we can sort of deduce from these different arguments. So maybe you can't get intelligence from the contingency argument, but you can get it from fine tuning, for example. Or maybe you can't get morally perfect from contingency, but you can get it from the moral argument. So these arguments taken together start to put together a picture of what this being is like. And so if you ever play that Guess Who game when you're a kid, we can kind of play that with these arguments. Now, for probably copyright reasons, I couldn't find a royalty-free picture of Guess Who, so you just have to imagine what that game looks like for the slide. But you know how you used to say, like, oh, does he have a mustache? No. And then you push down those tiles. And does he have a hat? And you push down those tiles. Well, here we've got various different attributes that we're pulling from these arguments. A personal, immaterial, powerful, morally good, morally perfect, actually necessary, intelligent creator of the universe. And if the ontological argument goes through, then we also get the omni traits, omnipotent, omniscient, all those sorts of things. And so who is this? I mean, who would this be other than God? It seems like God is a perfectly good candidate for this being that stands in these relations. And so for that reason, I think that the existence of contingent objects gives us good reasons to think that there is a necessary foundation that explains their existence. And then we can go from that into the theistic implications that we've been talking about. Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.